it's pretty straightforward, which is what does a great attendee experience look like for you as the organizer? What do you want that attendee to walk away feeling or experiencing? I feel like sometimes people forget about that and they're just kind of like, well, I sold them a ticket. Like I got how many thousands of people to show up, right? But I would say like for our events, like we try to think about, hey, if I'm a founder attending a founder event, did I come away with some tangible takeaways that I can think about or apply to my own business? Did I meet other people that I thought were nice and helpful?
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 20,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Did you know that over 70% of B2B trade are conducted on credit terms? However, many suppliers struggle to support this, leading to lost business opportunities. Fluid offers instant B2B financing with one tap, seamlessly integrating with marketplaces and supplier platforms. This payment flexibility empowers buyers to secure their purchases on credit terms or installments. This results in increased basket sizes and an influx of new buyers for suppliers. Fluid provides a great user experience and the ability to facilitate high-velocity trade. This differentiates Fluid from traditional digital lenders and invoice financing companies. Want to learn more? Get in touch with Tracy, Fluid's co-founder, at trasy@gofluid.io to learn more. Hey, Shiyan.
Hey, Jeremy, how's it going?
Good. It's another round of conference season. So it feels like there was one spike in September and now November. There's another spike that we have here.
I know, it's like the F1 Super Returns Switch FinTech Festival Q4 madness.
Yeah. And then we're going to throw in all the alumni galas this month on the social events, Thanksgiving events.
I do think it's funny that we celebrate Thanksgiving in Singapore, or like certain pockets of people celebrate Thanksgiving in Singapore, and not necessarily the people you would imagine.
Obviously, a lot of folks study the US as well as, the US base. Then also the Ray Dalio scored Singapore as the most US friendly out of all of the ASEAN folks in his recent article. I think we'll talk about it next time around, the US China dynamics, but it is what it is. So we were thinking about talking about conferences and how to make the best use of them and either attendee perspective or as a speaker / participant and organizer, because we've gone through so many of them and we've been to each other's conferences as well. All right, let's start with the spicy stuff first.
Okay.
What's the worst moments / worst thing that bugs you about conferences?
Oh man. I know this is why you keep me on the pod, just to say outrageous things, but still. I think conferences have a real purpose. It's like a great collection point of people and topics, but sometimes because of the things you have to do to get a conference organized, you need sponsors, right? You need certain people to show up, things like that. I think organizers kind of like twist themselves into knots and then you end up with weird setups. So I think one thing is when you have too many people on a panel. Because people are trying to be inclusive and maybe some of those people were sponsors, you kind of like shove them all into a panel. And then it ends up not being a conversation, really. I think it's really hard to have more than 3 people on a panel, personally.
Including a moderator?
Excluding the moderator. Because it's hard to just have a conversation with 8 people or 10 people, and everybody just passes the mic around and you say your 3 points, and like how much can you actually get done in 45 minutes or an hour? And you can't really build off of each other's, you can't really debate. I think that's people don't really think through the flow of how the conversation is going to go. So I think that's one sort of pet peeve I have, is that it seems like a waste of the people. Because clearly you see these people and you see their backgrounds and you're like, oh, these are really knowledgeable people. They will provide a super interesting insight, but somehow the format doesn't allow the moderator to pull that insight out. And so then it feels like a giant waste of time. And then everyone's on their phones anyway, which is, we didn't all come to this ballroom with very expensive parking to be on our phones listening to something that is useful, right? So I think that's one like pet peeve I have. I think on the flip side, my other pet peeve is like pre-panel prep calls, which actually should be emails. Basically, somebody be like, let's do a prep call, and you're just like, let's not, because there's like people from 6 different time zones or whatever it is. It's really hard to coordinate. And then you get on the call and it's, let's read this email together. And you're like, why are we doing this? So that's my speaker pet peeve. Okay, I've done complaining. Now your turn, Jeremy.
My turn. I think that we discussed this previously in the past, but I'm happy to hear your point of view as well. For me, is when all corporates speak and there isn't a point of view that's being clear in terms of your insights and what it is. I think in terms of any topic, I think there's three ways that you really can add value, right? I think the first is that you can be descriptive, you can be factual, you can bring numbers. So you're an expert and you're not necessarily providing a point of view, but at least you're providing some level of detail.
This is
One
like when the
approach.
consultants come on. They
Yeah, the
have their
consultants come on.
report, right? Per our research, blah, blah,
And
blah, blah.
yeah, and there's not much of a point of view from my perspective, but they're very factual and very descriptive. And you're like, you know what? That is value. You don't necessarily need to have a point of view, but you're just saying these are things that are happening. And then you're like, you know what? I didn't know that. These are things I didn't know about digital penetration or the seventh most common used app in X country. These are all interesting facts. I think there's one good way to add value. The second way, good way to add value is if you have a point of view. So you're just like different, right? You're actually speaking something. And then thirdly is, you're funny, right? So at least it's a charming conversation, right? And I think the best is you get at least 2 out of 3. I don't know, hopefully like charming and, contrarian, right? Or charming and factual, or factual and contrarian, and you're not charming. I think you get 2 out of 3. That's like a good one. But I just feel like there's a lot of conversations where you're like 1 out of 3 or worse, like 0 out of 3.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
like a good rule of thumb is that if it sounds like a press release, you shouldn't be on a panel. There's no value to being synchronous and live. That's actually what it is. The pandemic has made me much more impatient about low quality synchronicity. If it's gonna just be not that interesting, I would rather read it quickly sometime else, not have to consume it in a specific location at a specific time.
I mean, that's, life, right? Everything is competing with everyone else. And at a conference, if there's a panel, the truth is you're competing against networking outside the conference rooms.
Yeah, that was always true. It's just that I do feel like the pandemic has, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, made me much less tolerant. Sometimes I'm in something, I'm like, God, these people need to talk faster. Why can't I put them at 1.8? So that's if it's a monologue and it's not a conversation, then I probably should watch the video, right? But
Yeah.
I think what is awesome or with the potential of live events is that synchronous interplay. And that's kind of what people should be striving for in structuring panels and thinking about what the shape of that conversation should.
Yeah, I think one interesting trick that I've been working on as a moderator when I do come on is speaking with the panel and saying, hey, have this conversation at an expert level, right? And what I mean by that is a lot of people can necessarily, in front of the audience, they kind of like really overly simplify or say something that's very lowest common denominator because it's a large group. You're speaking in front of 100 people, 200 people. But I think I keep saying is, hey, have this conversation at an expert level because at least if you're speaking to each other in a context, because on a panel, everybody should be an expert. You've been created. So
Yeah.
talk to each other as experts.
We had
and
a
then-
great
yeah,
event on this topic, which is this last week we had an Angel Squad event where we had Hassan is the head of Coinbase for Singapore and Yamki, who's VP of policy at Circle. And so they're clearly speaking at an expert level and they were facilitated by the head of tech innovation at Julius Baer. So I thought it was a really good conversation because you had industry, you had policy, you had potential enterprise customer type of setup. And there was some term definition. Hey, here's an overview, here's what's going on. But I think there were like good, healthy back and forth debates
Yeah.
on the sort of salient issues that the industry is facing. So I like that framing that you have. Hey, just talk as experts and duke it out.
Yeah, because you give people the tone and say, hey, you want to please be contrarian. Nobody wants to do that because everybody wants to be agreeable. But you say, please be an expert. Because I think people don't understand these days that the audience is really sophisticated. If you're walking around the audience, it's like if there are 2 experts talking, you actually see the audience, if it's really expert, on their phones Googling. Like they're asking themselves, okay, this person mentioned ASEAN ABC, right? And someone's going to be typing ASEAN just to figure out what it is. And I think folks are just way more sophisticated than they used to be. And also the fact that they turn up your panel means that they're not a beginner, right? It means that they're interested. And interested beginner in the age of the internet is basically an intermediate person, pre-internet, because they can Google anything they want to do. And intermediate folks want to hear expert conversations. And expert in a room, honestly, they're either listening just to hear you speak and their point of view, or they're on the panel. So you might also have an expert conversation.
But I think moderators can take a stronger stance too. Sometimes moderators are just like traffic cops.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't really like that. And I think there is a role for a moderator to like synthesize, redirect, focus, really just try to like help to play the role of the audience champion, which is like, hey, folks in the audience probably have this level of understanding. Here's where they are. Can you give them a couple of like guideposts from this point forward so that we can like shape this conversation? The moderator needs to have a strong point of view on what their job is in the conversation versus sometimes you're just like, what is the moderator doing?
Or they're reading off a list of very prepared questions, and clearly the conversation is going to the left,
Off.
which is actually interesting. But then it's supposedly off, which is not off because it's an expert conversation. And then you try, or moderator is trying to pull that person back to this script that nobody's very interested in a fundamental structural level. That can be a tough one. And that's why I often say when I'm moderating, I always kind of like, here, look, here's the 5 to 10 questions that we could ask, but I'm going to follow the conversation where it's going to go. That's the most interesting aspect of it. So just take this as a guide. And the other thing is always make sure there's time for audience to ask questions. I don't understand why panels go for the whole hour. And I'm just like, just structure 20 to 30 minutes for audience Q&A, right? Worst case, you circle back to some of the questions. But I think audience engagement is such a big part of why people come to panels anyway, because they want to meet them. They want to have that moment. I think
Yeah.
Q&A is important.
I think on that though, that is like another good early engagement trick is to get the audience engaged up front. You do a show of hands on some of the, hey, what's your baseline knowledge? Or you take a quick poll, like, who believes controversial thing X versus controversial thing Y? And then that kind of gets the audience dialed in. And then you can kick off into the conversation with the panelists.
Yeah. I think one, I'm going to use that in the future. What I normally do at the start is I tell the audience and I promise them that there is going to be Q&A at X time mark. And I ask them to prepare questions beforehand because some people take time to process questions. Some people are more extroverted. They come up with questions on the fly. But, giving people like 20, 30 minutes to hear, but also move from a consumption basis to be like consumption, synthesis, and potentially ask a question mode kind of like kicks it up a little bit more, right?
Yeah. I agree.
So signposting that early Q&A is going to happen is important.
Yeah.
Any favorite like tips, tricks, approaches that you use in terms of like maybe speaking, even participating or moderating?
I think we went through the moderation ones. I mean, I think speaking on panels it depends on how the conversation is going. I think that depending on how it is, I will play either the contrarian or the goofball. So I try to read what the room needs from an energy perspective and try to move the ball forward, advance the conversational ball, so to speak. And so sometimes if it's like, I feel like everyone's too agreeable, I will try to say something a little bit different. Or if it's getting too serious, I'll try to crack a joke to try to lighten the tone a little bit. But I mostly just flow with the conversation and see what it is. Unless sometimes if I'm really outraged, then I'll just go nuts. But I try not to do that.
Yeah. I think one realization I had is that there's also a certain level as a panelist, because you don't have the full amount of time, is you have to say something digestible, but also to the point within that time allotment.
Yeah.
That's not an easy thing to do because as a speaker, you get 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So you can actually have a logic chain. But as a panelist, you just have a 2-minute.
Yeah, and I think it's better if you could connect what you're saying to what has already been said. So it's like you said, when you're a speaker, you're the one delivering all the points, but when you're a panelist, you need to like cherry pick other people's points to buttress your point to help connect the dots. And because you didn't have time to say those things, so as Jeremy said, blah, therefore, blah, 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 right? So you leverage something that's already been said. I think the other thing that I've found effective is little vignettes to make the point often are more effective than just saying the thing. It's like show don't tell, I think is the phrase. And so if you can recount like a small snippet, yet it kind of illustrates your point better. But then again, you have to be succinct. You can't, you have to have some awareness of not occupying too much airtime.
Not like a 20-minute story of how you went shopping and then at a shopping thing, you found some AI thing and then the AI thing improved your life.
What?
I was just like joking about what a 20-minute vignette would look like on a panel.
Yeah. So I think there's that. And I think also just like energy, bringing energy always helps, which is you make eye contact with the other panelists, you've got energy, you're not just, I think that is all like really useful on a panel.
Yeah. I think what I wish I saw more on panels, the ones at least I remember as an audience, is like disagreement. I always find that very clarifying.
Yes, I agree. And I do try to do that when I moderate, right? Which is like push people into, hey, it sounds like you're saying this, but it sounds like you don't necessarily agree on this point. Can we dig in a little bit more? And I think that's always helpful. How about being a conference attendee, Jeremy? Pro tips,
Well,
grouses.
as a conference attendee, I think there's two parts of it. One is network with the people you want to talk to, and the second is serendipity. And I think there's an interesting dynamic that's there. You just got to do the legwork beforehand, just be like, who's going to be there? Who do you want to meet with? Probably a speaker, and just kind of go through the list. Serendipity is just being open to try new things, new conversation, explore, go to the booths. I think there's a lot of stuff. So I think I always find it hard to have that balance. Sometimes if I go in without a plan, then I just end up feeling very lost. And on the other end, if you're too directed, then you just end up being very transactional in terms of how you're approaching the whole conference and not letting the atmosphere and the culture come in.
Fair
Cover
enough.
yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I err towards a little bit more serendipity, but I try to think these are the people I definitely want to talk to. And then I schedule those, but I build in like little buffer in between those scheduled points, and the buffer kind of lets me wander around a little bit, but then I always know where my next waypost is. Oh, I got to get over to talk to this person. But I think also just like when talking to someone in a conference is what are you going to say that is is impactful in the moment. Okay, pet peeve. I hate being pitched on the spot.
Wait, this sounds like if I was an attendee and I found out, I would totally pitch you on the spot.
Well, I would rather have a conversation, but I don't want to be pitched.
Ooh.
Which I think is different.
Yeah.
Which is, I think sometimes people get into their talk track and they just want to dump everything on you. And you're like, isn't the mind space I'm in right now? Versus, hey, like connecting it to something that, let's say we just had a panel on embedded finance and you have an embedded finance startup. You could start a conversation that was like, oh, it was interesting that the panel had this perspective on open banking and API access. I actually have a different view. I guess, and maybe this is just a stylistic preference
Right.
versus just blah, 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 and I'm raising. And you're just like, we're standing in the middle of 500 people. What do you want me to say? That's so great. Thank you. Please submit the form and we'll figure out if there's a time to talk, that kind of thing. It just, I don't know. You tell me. Do you enjoy being pitched on the spot? Should I just send everyone to you?
I am okay with being pitched on the spot, and I encourage people to be way more prepared to pitch people on the spot, but with like a 1 minute or like a 3 minute version, depending on how much time you have. Because I think the issue is like, yeah, if your pitch is like you haven't prepared in that sense, then it's not the best format to deliver. So I agree with you. I think if you can do a tight 60 seconds or do a tight 3 minute pitch, just do it. And then we can schedule something else from there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think the issue is if you're like not prepared, and then the whole it's not a good conversation, neither is a good pitch, right? And you don't put yourself in the best foot forward.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's less, I think sure you'll be less irritated if someone just gave you only a 1 minute pitch and then that's it.
Yeah.
'Cause the shortness of it helps.
Yeah. I think that goes back to like, I mean, I was talking with another investor about storytelling and why it's important. And like in that 60 seconds, can you sort of communicate succinctly, like, why should we spend more time on this? Versus assuming that, of course, somebody now wants to spend like another hour talking about this thing when they can't figure out what was happening in that 60 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is tough, right? Because if you ask me to explain something for an hour, it's probably the most boring 1 hour that you ever face. At least you can do it in an hour. But I think to do it in 10 minutes, then do a 3 minute version and a 1 minute version is actually takes a lot of work.
It reminds me of college. The first quarter, you write a 10-page paper. The second quarter, you write a 5-page paper. And last quarter, you have to write a 3-page paper.
Oh
And
boy, it's
it's really
impossible.
hard.
Yeah.
It's to get all your arguments down into 3 pages.
This is how you decrease the margins and you decrease the font size.
That only goes so far. Your 3 pages are not gonna expand it to 10 pages, right? Like, it's not possible.
I've definitely done that in the past. It's just like,
Of course, but yeah, I think it is a really good exercise. Like,
yeah.
how can you create something just with more economy?
Yeah. How should organizers go about this? We talk about participants, we talk about moderators. So obviously we have so many folks who are out organizing, right? You have Hustle Fund, you have Monks Adventures, you have Singapore FinTech Festival, Super Returns, Iterative. So many folks are out there organizing events. Any advice that you have?
I think it's pretty straightforward, right? Which is, what does a great attendee experience look like for you as the organizer? What do you want that attendee to walk away feeling or experiencing? I feel like sometimes people forget about that and they're just kind of, well, I sold them a ticket. Like, I got how many thousands of people to show up, right? And I don't think they necessarily care that much about what was that attendee's experience. But I would say, like, for our events, like, we try to think about, hey, if I'm a founder attending a founder event, like, did I come away with some like tangible takeaways that I can think about or apply to my own business? Did I meet other people that I thought were like nice and helpful, right? And then, of course, like, events are also marketing, which is like, did I walk away with a better impression or a better feel of Hustle Fund than before I came to one of their events? So I think it's sort of like very simply like, if the event is the product, what is your customer's user journey? What is the outcome that you want them to have experienced? And maybe if like you're a bigger organizer like FinTech Festival or whatever, it's, hey, was this a place where exhibitors were able to meet relevant potential customers, right? And attendees, customers were able to be exposed to new products and trends that they weren't otherwise able to see. Were you able to facilitate good conversations between those people? And maybe you can measure kind of that via like how many meetings were facilitated or, surveying attendees. But it is a little random. Sometimes they have all these conference apps where they're like, hey, ask people for a meeting. And then you just have a barrage of people being like, can I meet you? And you're like, who are you?
Yeah.
What do you do? Is this the right form? I mean, I think, but it's hard, right? Because their scale is so big. So I don't know. I think it's a hard job to figure out how to get all these people to, meet the right people that works for them. And then there is still a level of serendipity that you can't control all of it. But okay, if there's some serendipity, like, how do you set up those serendipitous interactions in a way that is Yeah, positive. How about you? You just organized a big event in Vietnam. How did you think about what were the outcomes you were trying to drive?
I think one reflection is that when you are putting together a panel, it's important to capture the question that people have in their minds, whatever the questions are, right? And I think a good panel question actually drives a lot of energy across the audience who wants to be there. It creates self-selection in the audience, helps you create better the group of speakers know what they're going to be talking about. So I think questions can be quite a fleeting thing as well. So for example, like 3 months ago, AI was a very kind of question that was very much on everybody's minds. But I think now it feels a little bit, I won't say resolved, but at least it doesn't feel like it's the current question of the day in that sense. And I think that's really important because I think a lot of people put question, they deliver the panel as if this is the answer, if that makes sense. I think designing as a question of the month in that sense is really a critical step that you tend to do the least amount of prep in that sense. And also you said it the earliest, right? So I think that requires also you to be a little bit curatorial in your taste, if that makes sense, because you're also to some extent forecasting what the conversation topic is going to be next month as well, right? So
So that's interesting, right? I think people don't do this as much, but with South by Southwest, people end
right.
up voting for the panels.
Yeah.
So you do get a bit more of that audience feedback on
Yeah.
what's interesting to them
Yeah.
versus the organizer having to be like, okay, I think this is what people want to talk about.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I actually don't think I've seen that many conferences employ that strategy. And then the second thing, which now that you're talking about this, I do wish, I mean, and we could do more of this too, is the flow of the conversation, having real time audience questions submitted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, because they're listening, right? And
Right.
then they can sort of be like, oh, well, that's an interesting point. And then you can like put it into the stream and other people can see it. I
Yeah.
think that's actually kind of an interesting sort of parallel conversation because that's actually something I like about Zoom events where you kind of have the chat alongside
Yeah.
and it's interesting to see what other people are reacting to or resonating with. And then as a moderator, when you hit Q&A, you can go back and look at the chat and be like, oh, it seems like there was a lot of energy around this topic.
Right.
It got upvoted or whatever it is. And so let's go ask that question. But there are probably more opportunities to leverage technology to do more of that and
Yeah.
keep it as a conversation rather than this very just these four people on stage kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And honestly, you made me suddenly think of a republic versus democracy. So I think when you have the panelists and you have the moderators, more of a republic, where the moderator represents the interest of the audience, and then you have audience Q&A, some on the spectrum. Whereas I think where it's primarily the audience giving that chat is closer to a more democratic system, right? But I mean, not necessarily have the full narrative you're trying to go for. But I think for me, I've been a moderator in both types. I can tell you that I think in terms of audience value, I think the democratic one definitely outperforms because people are more engaged throughout the entire conversation because you can ask a question anytime round. But I do feel like your role is more diminished, right? But I'm just saying, you're like a little bit like a dumb terminal where you're just like saying, okay, looks like everybody wants to ask this question, right? So I'm just saying, like, I don't disagree with that. Actually, personally, I think the more democratic approach is probably a little bit more up to date with modern tastes. I'm just saying that,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balance to capture both, right? It is back to your thing, which is questions are more interesting than the answers. Making
Yeah.
it more dynamic generates more questions
Exactly.
versus just saying, hey, we presume, oh, mighty people on the platform, tell us the truth, the answer. And that's just not, I think that's not the case. And we're all kind of on a journey and we're all trying to figure stuff
Yeah.
out, right? And
Yeah.
so I actually like that. And also, like you said, audience is actually much more sophisticated and it is quite possible that things can be answered by the audience. They don't need to be, not everything has to be filtered up to the
Yeah.
panel, right? And so you
Yeah.
kind of have its own organic conversation, but I guess it can be a lot to keep track of if you had to both listen to someone and track like a conversation, but I don't know, maybe that's just modern life.
I mean, if you think about it, if you had panel audience of 100 people and you answer the questions of 10 people, that means 1 in 10 person had a magical moment that probably made their conference, right? Because you answered their specific question versus, if you had an entire just panel not address any audience Q&A on the other end of the spectrum, then, it could be good content, but it's not.
I don't know. I also think that it can also go off the rails where sometimes you see these questions and you're like, who is in this room right now? Are they insane?
It's just complaining about democracy, basically. I mean, yeah, I guess one issue about that approach is that it does feel like a little bit ping-pongy because one question the top voted question could be more automatically linked to the fifth voted question. So,
But you can, I think
yeah.
that's your prerogative as the moderator. You
Yeah,
don't
exactly.
have to go in like rank order or whatever. You're just
Yeah,
like, I don't think these are actually that interesting. Not going to. But hey, here are some other things that like, and you could collapse a bunch of things into buckets too, right? Which is
yeah.
like part of it. But but oh, this gives me now I kind of want to this at our next event.
Yeah, I know. That's something that on the Brave podcast side also, we're starting to like poke around and say, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do something in person? We mentioned that before in the past as well. So
We should do it.
yeah, we should do it. Yeah, maybe some kind of unconference, maybe,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean,
just try it.
it's well, I think I don't know. It's like one of those things where conferences you always try to get these like famous people to speak. They're like the
Right,
headliners, but often like you can actually have really possibly more substantive conversations with like more mid-level subject matter experts.
right.
It's kind of
Yeah,
like Twitter.
yeah,
Sometimes you end up following people on Twitter who are not famous per se, but they know
yeah.
a lot about a specific thing. And that's like a challenging dynamic because if you're the organizer, you want a famous person because you want someone famous to put on the website, be like, oh, Tim Cook is coming, right? But actually, the person who probably knows a lot is, oh, you're like the engineering manager in charge of the hardware for the MacBook Pro or something, whatever it is. And so, how do you generate those conversations?
Right,
I think that's actually kind of like an interesting problem to me that I often am like, and it's not because famous people don't know anything, but it's more like famous people are much more constrained in what they can say publicly. So then they end up sounding like press releases.
unless they're retired.
Because
Maybe,
like their
yeah.
PR teams kind of be like, hey, here's our official position, right? Stay on point. Don't say rant and move the stock price.
Yeah. On that note, I'd love to kind of wrap things up and I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways. First of all, thanks so much for sharing about our things that we hate most in a conference. So we're talking about low value, low density, low charisma conversation, but also kind of talking about the converse, which is what are the moments that can make a conference magical and special and serendipitous. Secondly, thanks for sharing, I think, how speakers and moderators can improve how they speak. So we talked about some hacks, some tricks, some tips about how to position the conversation better, to be aware what role is being built and displayed, but also figuring out where the conversation is going. Lastly, thanks so much for sharing about how, as attendees, what do we appreciate? How do we organize it? What are the kind of events that we're looking out for? So on that note, thank you so much, Shiyan, for sharing.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.